Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics, or are your politics starting to shape your faith? In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists that we have today. First, we have Mr. Jason Thacker, who's with us. He's the Chair of Research and Technology at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. We have Ms. Melissa Reed, who's the Director of Government Affairs for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine. And we have Mr. Wilmer Leon, who's a nationally syndicated columnist and a regular contributor to national and international television news programs and newspapers. Ladies and gentlemen, good having you here with us and looking forward to our discussion today. You know, one of the things that's interesting in our society is that we have this idea that most of the time when people are starting to determine what they would do from a religious belief standpoint, that a lot of it has to do with getting tracts and, hearing from your pastor and friends and individuals. But we're starting to realize that the reality is, that's confronting us, is that we are now living in a digital society, and the challenge for some of us is really basic. And the belief that we are hearing is that more people are learning about things in the public square, not necessarily from going to what you would call your houses of worship every week, but people are actually starting to get more of their Christian beliefs and their other beliefs as a result of digital engagement. And therefore, digital engagement is now in a position where when you're on the internet, where you're taking a look to see what's going on from a political media standpoint, that there is now this intense debate that maybe we're learning more about our religion online than we are learning about it in the church. Jason, you're somebody who spent a lot of time researching in this area and taking a look at what's actually happening in the American culture from a political standpoint and from a religious standpoint. What are you starting to find, and how long is it taking you to put this information together?
Yeah, I think over the last few years, we're starting to see how technology is shaping and forming us as people. I think for the longest time, we just assumed, well, these are tools that we use. We can use them for good or for ill. But especially in the last few years, especially throughout a lot of the lockdowns and COVID protocols, we saw people thrust online. We realized that there was something about technology that's shaping and forming us. We see this in our social media habits. We see this in our news intake. We see this in our politics. And one of the things I think a lot of pastors and parishioners and priests are starting to learn is that your people are constantly connected to their devices. Often the first thing they see when they wake up, the last thing they see at the end of the day, and they're constantly surrounded. Even right now, my phone's about a foot from me at all times. So we start to realize these devices are forming and shaping us, especially the information that we see. And that's one of the designs. These technologies are not neutral. They're actually intended to shape our values, shape our actions, shape our beliefs in many ways. I think it's high time for us to kind of realize that technology is not just merely a tool, but it's something that we still bear responsibility and agency as we use these devices each day.
Orlin, just hearing Jason talk, I have to admit, I often feel when I'm talking about technology like the Supreme Court justices hearing the recent Twitter and Google cases in over my head. And I think that is a problem for many people. We are users of social media, but we really don't understand it. So we don't understand, as Jason is saying, that these devices are coaching us on what values are important and what values should guide our thinking, not just about, cats and cute dogs, but on how we should vote and how we should think about the world around us. And I think it is a case, Orlin, of just simple mathematics, because in the past, as you pointed out, the pastor had the attention of his or her parishioners for 1 hour a week. But now there's another force for the other 167 hours in the week that is, taking over our minds, that is, feeding into our every waking moment. So, how we deal with that is, I think, going to be one of the biggest challenges, not just for us as people of faith, but as citizens, as part of a body politic.
It's interesting. We're talking about, this is our new space where we're communicating. We know Gen Z and millennials, that, social media is where they get by and large, their news information. This is, and as Jason said, is absolutely shaping how we view various issues, various policies. There isn't a quick fix as far as, how do we make sure that, or how do we try to ensure that these platforms are neutral? Because as Jason said, they're not, they're based on algorithms, and they're based on the choices that we have made as far as our viewing and our commenting, our engagement with these platforms. We certainly know that social media and the digital space has been so beneficial for people of faith as far as ministry opportunities, opening up the world, to people of faith to be able to share and evangelize and have conversations with each other, find a home for of like-minded people. And so certainly, we don't want to also look to, as we talk about regulations, oftentimes we see a challenge, as we did with the Supreme Court cases, we look to the government to solve these issues. But I don't know if that's the appropriate space to look into. Do we want that government overreach interaction?
But Leon, how troubling is it? You're somebody who's dealing with a lot of national, international individuals that are listening, and most of them can only really get their information from a quote unquote, electronic media. They're never going to sit in a congregation here. So, when you find out that now that's the tool that's actually really shaping the minds of even the folk that you're trying to give information to, how much of a struggle has that been, or has it been more of a help?
It's an ongoing struggle because a lot of people misinterpret or misunderstand. They think that these devices are benign, when in fact, you really have to pay attention to who is creating the content, where is the content coming from, and in many instances, who's managing or limiting the content. And there are, as stated earlier, there are algorithms that are involved. You've got Twitter, and you've got these other platforms that are deplatforming people because it has been determined by some mind in the sky that they don't really like what's being transmitted. And in many instances, we're finding out that when the government gets involved, they're limiting access to information instead of providing more access to information. And I've always believed the best way to counter a narrative is with a better narrative. Don't limit what people have access to. Let people decide for themselves. So this public square, this digital electronic public square, is not nearly as benign as a lot of people believe that it is.
Well, Jason, it seems like the thought process is it's not supposed to be benign. They want it to be lethal. They want it to be something that's going to be impacting you in a way that's not just going to inform you, but they're hoping it will actually transform you into being a complete different person. I mean, if this is where we are, it sounds like you're just going to have to move forward and accept this, because I'm not sure we can basically, put the toothpaste back in the tube on this.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right in many ways. We can't go back to a pre-digital age. And I think a lot of the longings to get back to a pre-digital age have some merit to them in some ways, but they're also, each society, each generation has their own issues and challenges that they face. This is the one that we face. This is the one that God has placed us in a time and place to give us, hopefully for us to cultivate wisdom. I think that's really the key for how we navigate this. As Melissa said earlier, there isn't really a quick fix here. We can't just say, well, the government needs to fix this, or we need technology companies to fix this. We really need all of us involved. And I think one of the core of the wisdom tradition, especially with my faith tradition, is cultivating that wisdom of how we navigate these things and take responsibility and develop virtue and certain habits about how we utilize these devices. Also looking to government, also looking to the technology industry to say we're all in this together, and we need to be able to cultivate rules and regulations. But as Wilmore said as well, is there's a lot of information here. Having greater access to information by and large does our society good. One of the challenges that we face is, even if we regulate it here in the United States through various government interaction, these are transnational entities. They're working across the globe. So the decisions that are made here in the United States are also affecting other nations. We have the European Union and others. making various rules. And I think we need to take a more holistic approach to how we navigate a lot of the challenges before us, not just looking for a quick fix or a simple technical solution or just an app to fix something to kind of cultivate a better habit, is to really take a more holistic picture and understanding how our faith informs and shapes how we approach a lot of these theological and ethical issues in the public square today.
You know, Bettina, a lot of what people will say is that, you know, tools are really just going to exasperate who you really are. You know, you're someone that if you're going down a certain road, these tools allow you to just get down that road quicker. You know, based on how society is kind of guiding individuals, it sounds as though we're really in a what I would call a free fall, that unless you actually have something within you that stops the free fall, that this type of information will just allow you to continue to, you know, perpetuate in these directions, whether they be good or bad.
You're right, Orlin, because, you know, when many people are asked, what is the problem with social media? Why are these platforms so damaging to our political space? They'll talk about content, but content is not really the issue that we're talking about here. You know, as others have said, unhelpful narratives, conspiracy theories, destructive ideas, these have always existed. The real problem here is that, you know, social media is distorting our perception of the public sphere. You know, it's as we create our own little self-curated bubble of information around us, we start thinking that this little bubble of information that we have self-selected for ourselves reflects the reality out there. We're no longer operating as part of a broader public discourse. We've become locked into our own private discourse where all our beliefs are being constantly reinforced.
Wow.
So, Orlin, you're absolutely right. This is the problem. You know, it's interesting, going back to what Melissa said earlier about some wanting the government to get involved. Well, if you look at what happened in the recent decisions of the Supreme Court in the Twitter and Google cases, the court is basically saying to the government, do your job. Get in there and fix, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. You know, start working out what we can do about this. And I'd be interested to know what Jason thinks about this, because this presents a whole, kettle of fish for free speech issues. How is the government going to regulate a platform that is engaged in constitutionally protected speech? I mean, this is the catch-22 we find ourselves in right now.
Yeah. You know, Leon, I got to ask you a question, though. As somebody who's responsible, for example, of taking in information and then have to disperse the news, it seems like this now has made your job a whole lot easier, that, you know, the quote-unquote trusted source that you get information from, you have to almost do your own vetting to determine what's considered to be trusted or not.
Well, you're absolutely right. You do have to do your own vetting. And getting back to an earlier point, a lot of people are siloing their information. In many instances, people aren't using these platforms to learn and to broaden their perspective. They're using these platforms to validate what they believe to already be true. They don't want to be challenged. They don't want a different narrative. And what we're finding in many instances when the government gets involved and they're deplatforming people, take, for example, the situation in Ukraine. If you go to Twitter or you go to Facebook and you start challenging the dominant narrative put out by Western media, your post will be taken down. You may wind up being deplatformed because you're challenging the dominant narrative. So yes, it is very, very important to ask yourself first a simple question. Does the story I'm reading make sense? Does it, just on its face, does it make sense? And what's happening now with the advent also of artificial intelligence, we're starting to see a lot of things that are being generated that are just based upon algorithms, and they're not necessarily true. So yes, you do have to validate, you do have to do your own research to be sure that the sources that you are accessing are credible.
I'm going to have to let that be the last word, but boy, when you take a look at this, it almost sounds like it's the rage of the machine that's getting ready to take over. And we've got to make sure that we're on top of things, or else we'll be part more of the problem than really the solution. You know, there's a case that I've gotten a lot of phone calls from some of our viewers. They've been hearing about this quote unquote cake that had something to do with the LGBT community, had to do with religion. And the case was called the Masterpiece Cake Shop versus the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. You know, Masterpiece happened to be a company that was engaged in the process of basically making cakes. And they did it for all kinds of accommodations. And what ended up happening, this matter ended up before the Supreme Court, in which there was a question of, can there be an accommodation that is refused based on the First Amendment claims of free speech if it turns out that somebody is asking you to do something that quote unquote is in violation of your religious beliefs. This case really started to get the whole world talking about what type of services do I have to perform, or what type of services do I don't have to perform as it relates to being out in the public square. You know, Bettina, can you tell us a little bit about this whole Masterpiece case and how it's kind of like set the stage for additional arguments that we've been talking about for a long period of time regarding how do I get to demonstrate my faith when I'm quote unquote in a public service business?
You know, this case is so interesting, Orlin, because you're right, it's become kind of this byword for this whole clash between religious freedom and LGBTQ rights. It's sort of, you know, the cake baker situation. This is the word we use to describe that perceived clash between those two fundamental rights. But in reality, in this case, the Supreme Court basically kicked the can down the road because it didn't actually reach some of the key First Amendment issues that were raised. And so it ruled on this very narrow ground, which was more or less based on some of the negative comments that the Colorado commissioners made against the religious faith of the plaintiff in that case. And they said, you know, this clearly displays a lack of neutrality toward religious belief. And on those grounds, it ruled. It really didn't get into that key question that you asked, Orlin, as to what right a person has who holds to a traditional view of human sexuality to refuse to provide an expressive service, such as baking a cake, in contravention of their own beliefs. So it didn't get to that, but what it did was set the stage. And so now you have a new case that's emerged, which the court heard recently, 303 Creative. Is exactly the same law in Colorado that this case comes under, and it is this time a website designer. And the questions presented in this case are far cleaner, if you like. And it would be very surprising if the Supreme Court was able to avoid ruling clearly on some of these key First Amendment issues in this case, but we're still waiting for it.
I have a real problem with this issue because I believe that a business should not be allowed to discriminate based on any precept, principle, or belief. If you have to get a business license from the city or from the state in order to engage in your business, then as a pretext of getting that license, you have to agree to serve the public. And if you choose, or if you decide that for whatever reason, there are certain elements of the public that you don't want to serve, you're in the wrong business. So to me, it's analogous to what was used during the civil rights movement or post-civil rights movement. Once we got the voting rights cases and the equal accommodations cases, if you're receiving federal funding for the business that you engage in, you can't discriminate. And so to me, getting a business license from the state is very similar to getting funding from the federal government. If you get funding from the federal government, you got to serve all comers. If you get a business license from the state, you got to serve all comers. And I also wonder why a couple, but here's the flip side of that. I don't understand why a couple would want to go to a business that doesn't support them in the first place. To me, just go to another cake shop. But from a public policy perspective, businesses should not be allowed to be selective in who they choose to serve and what accommodations they choose to make for the patrons that they do decide to serve. When you get a business license from the city or the state, you do business and you can't discriminate.
Well, Jason, sorry, go ahead, Melissa.
I was just going to say, I completely agree with Wilmer as far as, there is not an option under U.S. law that just says you are not allowed to discriminate as far as their service, as far as which individuals. I think that the important distinction is the case that came before it, the ones that we've seen with florists and what other wedding vendors, is not so much about serving a particular individual or couples, but supporting a particular event. Right? It's not that they are closing the doors to a particular segment of the population. It's in fact that they are, because of the creative work that's involved in what they're doing, they feel that that's an endorsement of something that is counter to their belief system. So, I think that distinction is important.
But
I think that's a distinction without a difference. I think that's a distinction without a difference. If you're in the business of baking cakes, then bake cakes. If you're in the business of serving individuals at a restaurant, then you serve individuals at a restaurant. So the creative element of it, to me, is secondary to what is actually being done. So I don't go to a bicycle shop and ask the bicycle shop to bake a cake. I don't go to a cake baker and ask the bake caker to fix my bicycle. If I go to get my bicycle fixed and the mechanic says, if I happen to be gay, I don't repair flat tires for people who are gay. At the end of the day, you are in business to do a service, whatever that service is. Provide that service and do not discriminate against people that come to your business for that service.
Well, Jason, you're actually at a religious institution, and the idea of how do you get a chance to get your faith involved in what you do, or should it not be involved?
Yeah, I think Wilmer and Melissa are bringing up a really good point. One of the things to note about the Jack Phillips case, as well as Arlene Flower Shop out of Seattle, is that these businesses were serving. They were serving without discrimination. They were serving all customers, including actually those who came to them asking for a cake. They had created many cakes, especially Jack, for various couples and various events, but it was a particular part of the wedding, a same-sex wedding, that he did not want to participate in because that violated his deeply held beliefs. One of the things that I think we have to realize in this debate that's already been kind of brought up is that we live in this myth of the idea of the public square as this neutral space. The reality is all of us, whether we have faith or no faith at all, are wanting to live out our deeply held beliefs in the public square. And naturally, as people of faith, our faith is going to interact and it's going to shape how we do everything from business to politics to policy to our worship to our family and all of these different things. So the idea that we can somehow segment out our deeply held beliefs in, quote, the public square, I think we need to realize that there's no such thing as a really neutral space. It's the question of whose God is going to be able to serve. Is it my God, my big G God, my little g gods, or no God at all? Is that we should be able to freely live out our deeply held beliefs in every single aspect of our life, realizing that there's value and dignity and worth in every single human being is created in the very image of God.
Bettina, but I'm trying to understand, if I've got a problem with something because of my faith, your lifestyle is something I disagree with, but I also believe in the 10 Commandments. And so if you're a liar, if you're somebody who takes God's name in vain, and I'm making a cake for you, do I have to draw that distinction, or am I picking what part of the Bible works for me? And as a result thereof, there is a certain amount of discrimination taking place.
Well, Orlin, it's interesting that this case, the Masterpiece Cake case, also the 303 Creative case, the website designer case, they are grounded not just in religious freedom objections or issues, but also free speech and the idea of compelled speech. And so the question becomes, how far can the government compel an individual to speak, to express oneself in ways that go against their deeply held convictions, religious convictions? And so, Orlin, I think, this whole question is, it gets so caught in the granular details that we forget the bigger picture that Jason actually just laid out for us, that this is a pluralistic society. We have people who are making choices that we may not agree with. I don't agree with everything that I'm sure my fellow panelists believe, but we have to find ways to all live together, work together, make sure everyone's protected equally under the law. Everyone has is publicly accommodated in ways that allows them to participate in society and allows everyone to flourish. We need to find those ways. I don't think the way to do that is by shrinking and diminishing religious freedom and religious freedom rights and saying to people of faith, you need to either change your beliefs or get out of certain aspects of participation in society. I think we can find creative and supportive ways for everyone to live together in this pluralistic America.
Well, I'm going to have to let that be the last word, Bettina, but I think what we're looking at here is we've got a society that's already made their choices as to what side of the fence they're going to be on. And the question is, when we find ourselves in the courtroom, how do we end up figuring out how to determine whether someone is devout, whether this is something that's actually important to them? And I don't want to see the courts involved in getting into the sincerity of an individual. And so I think what we have to do is kind of start out by taking people at their words. But as I heard one great politician say, yeah, we're going to trust, but we also are going to have to verify. Hey, Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
Sure, Arlen. Going back to the conversation about the digital space. So while TikTok continues to rise in popularity among Gen Z, the top social media platform for that age group is YouTube, which, as you know, is great news for faith and politics and its potential exposure to that group.
Wilmer, tell me something I don't know.
Let's try Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will not be on the Democrat ticket for president. You're probably going to be looking at Gavin Newsom and I think it's Christian Whitmer from Michigan.
Wow. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
So, Orlin, I recently came across a study which confirmed my own observational study in my own household with my teenager. Did you know that maybe up to 10% of Americans actually meet the criteria for social media addiction?
Wow. Jason, tell me something I don't know.
I think in the last few months, all of us seen the AI hype cycle in terms of artificial intelligence. But one of the things I think we should all realize is that we've long been utilizing these technologies every single day, every minute of the day, whether we realize it or not. It's not a far off phenomenon, but it's something that is actually shaping us deeply even as we speak.
Thank you a lot. Appreciate the conversation today. This was really something that's going to cause our listeners to think and to wonder in the future. Hey, thanks again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.